20 years after the guns of the First World War had fallen silent, Europe stood once again on the brink of catastrophe. The 1919 Treaty of Versailles had ended one conflict but sowed the seeds for another. Its harsh terms dismembered Germany, imposed crushing reparations, and humiliated a proud nation that would seek revenge. The League of Nations, formed to prevent future wars, proved toothless in the face of rising dictatorships. By the late 1930s, fascism had swept across Italy and Germany, militarism was resurgent in Japan, and the democracies of Britain and France were haunted by memories of trench warfare, reluctant to fight again. Before starting our video, if you love to watch history-related stories about World War II, please subscribe to our channel and like the video so it helps me to make more good quality videos for you. Let's the story started. The rise of Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler, a failed Austrian artist turned political agitator, rose to power promising to restore Germany's glory. His Nazi party harnessed the anger of millions impoverished by economic collapse and national shame. By 1933, he had become chancellor. Within a year, democracy was dismantled, opponents jailed or murdered, and the swastika flag flew over every government building. Hitler's goals were explicit: unite all Germans, expand eastward for living space, and overturn the post-Versailles order. Through the 1930s, he tested the resolve of Europe. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, the annexation of Austria in 1938, and the seizure of Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland later that year went unanswered. Each act emboldened him further. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement, giving concessions to avoid war, seemed to confirm Hitler's belief that the Western powers would not fight. The spark in Poland. Poland, reborn after World War I, lay between two aggressive powers, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Hitler viewed it as both obstacle and opportunity, a route to his eastern ambitions and a population he deemed inferior. In early 1939, Germany began demanding the return of the free city of Danzig, modern Gdansk, and the right to build an extraterritorial highway across Polish territory. Warsaw refused, aware that surrendering to such demands meant losing sovereignty. Britain and France, alarmed by the occupation of Prague, guaranteed Poland's independence in March 1939. If Germany attacked, they promised war. Hitler dismissed these pledges as empty threats, but he hesitated for one reason: fear of fighting a two-front war. To neutralize the Soviet Union, he sought an unprecedented deal: the Nazi-Soviet Pact. On August 23, 1939, German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop flew to Moscow to meet Joseph Stalin. The two regimes, ideological enemies, stunned the world by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty that secretly divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Germany would take Western Poland. The USSR would seize the East and the Baltic states. The pact gave Hitler the green light. The invasion begins. At dawn on September 1, 1939, the skies over Poland roared with the engines of the Luftwaffe. German bombers struck cities, railways, and airfields. The attack on the radio station at Gliwice, staged by German operatives dressed as Poles, served as a fabricated pretext for war. Hitler declared before the Reichstag that Germany was merely defending itself from Polish aggression. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, was unleashed. Fast-moving tank divisions spearheaded assaults while dive bombers sowed terror from above. Within days, German armor encircled Polish armies, cutting supply lines and communications. Civilians fled in panic along bomb-riddled roads. Warsaw resisted valiantly but faced relentless bombardment. The West declares war. Britain issued an ultimatum: withdraw from Poland or face war. When no reply came, Prime Minister Chamberlain addressed the nation on September 3, 1939. This country is at war with Germany. France followed hours later. The Second World War had begun. Yet, in those early weeks, the Western Allies did little. Their armies mobilized along the Franco-German border but launched no offensive. This eerie calm became known as the Phony War. In Poland, however, the destruction was real. The Soviet invasion. On September 17th, Soviet troops poured into eastern Poland, claiming to protect fellow Slavs after the Polish state, ceased to exist. Caught between two invaders, Poland was doomed. The government fled into exile. Warsaw surrendered on September 27th. By early October, the country was carved up according to the secret pact. The war's first campaign had ended in tragedy. Over 200,000 Polish soldiers killed or wounded, and millions subjected to occupation. Life under occupation. Germany annexed Western Poland and created the General Government, a zone of ruthless exploitation. The Nazi regime began its program of terror, mass arrests of intellectuals, executions of clergy, and the first steps toward the annihilation of Poland's Jews. In Soviet-occupied zones, deportations to Siberia and mass killings like the later Katyn Forest massacre crushed resistance. The Winter War and expansion. While Europe braced for the next move, Stalin turned north. In November 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland, expecting a swift victory. The tiny nation fought ferociously in the freezing wilderness, earning global admiration before being overwhelmed in March 1940. Meanwhile, Hitler's gaze shifted westward. To secure resources and prepare for war against Britain and France, he planned invasions of Denmark and Norway. The phony war in the West. From September 1939 to May 1940, the Western Front remained largely quiet. British troops, the British Expeditionary Force, joined French defenses along the Maginot Line, a string of fortifications stretching from Switzerland to Luxembourg. Newspapers joked about soldiers fighting boredom. Yet beneath the calm, both sides rearmed feverishly. Germany refined its Blitzkrieg tactics. The Allies clung to outdated strategies rooted in the last war. Economic and naval warfare. The war at sea began immediately. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships to starve Britain of supplies. On September 3, 1939, the SS Athenia was torpedoed, killing 112 civilians, the war's first naval disaster. Britain imposed a blockade on Germany in response. The Battle of the Atlantic, destined to last the entire war, had begun. Hitler's gamble. By year's end, Hitler had achieved his first major victory. Poland was erased, the Western Allies had declared war but not acted, and the Soviet Union was temporarily friendly. To his generals, Hitler appeared invincible. He told them, "We are at the turning point of destiny." Few yet grasped that the world was sliding into a conflict that would consume more than 70 million lives. The seeds of global conflict. Beyond Europe, the world watched nervously. In Asia, Japan's brutal war in China raged on. Italy's dictator Benito Mussolini weighed whether to join Germany's triumphs. The United States, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, remained officially neutral but began preparing for the worst. By December 1939, the pattern was set. The Axis would strike. The democracies would react too slowly. In less than a year, Hitler had overturned the balance of power in Europe. But the storm was only beginning. The fall of France and the Battle of Britain. A quiet before the storm. As winter settled over Europe in early 1940, the guns fell silent along the Western Front. British and French soldiers waited behind the Maginot Line, a vast network of bunkers, trenches, and fortifications thought to be impregnable. They called it the Sitzkrieg, the sitting war. Newspapers mocked the inaction with cartoons of soldiers sipping wine and tea while the Germans prepared. But in Berlin, Adolf Hitler was anything but idle. He saw France as the next domino. Germany could not defeat Britain until the mainland of Europe was under his control. Yet a direct assault through the fortified Maginot Line was impossible. He needed a new strategy, one bold enough to shock the world. The Scandinavian Gambit. Before turning west, Hitler aimed north. Control of Norway and Denmark would secure vital shipping lanes for Swedish iron ore, essential to German industry. On April 9, 1940, Germany struck without warning, Operation Weserübung. Denmark capitulated within 6 hours. Norway resisted fiercely, aided by British and French forces who landed at Narvik and Trondheim. But German paratroopers, naval landings, and air superiority quickly overwhelmed the defenders. By early June, Norway too was under Nazi rule. Though small in scale, the campaign revealed something revolutionary: Air power and mobility could crush traditional defenses. Winston Churchill, who had replaced the disgraced First Lord of the Admiralty during the Norway fiasco, would soon lead Britain itself. Hitler turns west. France awaited its fate. Hitler approved Case Yellow, Fall Gelb, an invasion plan through the Low Countries. The Allies expected the Germans to repeat their 1914 route through Belgium, so they prepared to rush north and block them. But one German general, Erich von Manstein, proposed a daring alternative. Instead of striking only through Belgium, he would send the main force, armored divisions under Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel, through the Ardennes forest, considered impassable for tanks. Once through, they would race to the English Channel, cutting off the Allied armies. Hitler seized on the plan. The Blitzkrieg unleashed, May 1940. At dawn on May 10, 1940, Germany invaded Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Paratroopers seized key bridges and fortresses before defenders could react. The Dutch fought bravely, but when the Luftwaffe leveled Rotterdam on May 14, killing nearly 900 people, they surrendered. Belgium held on longer, but the real thrust was already in motion. Through the dense Ardennes, German tanks rolled like a steel tide. French commanders dismissed early reports as impossible, until it was too late. On May 13, Guderian's panzers crossed the Meuse River near Sedan. The Luftwaffe bombed French defenses to rubble. Within hours, the German armor broke through. The Allies rushed north to defend Belgium, leaving their flanks open. In one of the most devastating maneuvers in military history, German forces swept behind them, racing westward toward the Channel. Within 10 days, the cream of the British and French armies were surrounded near Dunkirk. Dunkirk, the miracle of evacuation. By late May, 400,000 Allied troops were trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, pressed against the sea. German tanks halted briefly. Hitler, misled by Hermann Göring's assurance that the Luftwaffe could finish the job from the air. That pause saved the Allies. Operation Dynamo began on May 26. Under relentless bombing, hundreds of naval ships and civilian boats, fishing trawlers, ferries, yachts, crossed the Channel to rescue stranded soldiers. Over 338,000 men were evacuated by June 4. Churchill called it a miracle of deliverance, but reminded Britain, wars are not won by evacuations. France's fate was sealed. German forces regrouped and surged south. Paris fell without a fight on June 14, 1940. The French government signed an armistice at Compiègne, in the same railway car where Germany had surrendered in 1918. Hitler watched, exultant, as revenge was complete. France divided. Under the armistice, northern France was occupied by Germany, while the south became a nominally independent regime, Vichy France, led by Marshal Philippe Pétain. Though claiming neutrality, Vichy collaborated with the Nazis, turning over Jews and dissidents. Meanwhile, Charles de Gaulle, a young brigadier, fled to London and broadcast a call for resistance. France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war. Britain stands alone. By mid-1940, all of Western Europe lay under the swastika. Hitler expected Britain to seek peace. He admired the British Empire and hoped they would accept German dominance of the continent. But the new British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, had no intention of surrendering. In his first address to Parliament, he declared, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." He promised that Britain would fight on the beaches, fight on the landing grounds, and never surrender. Hitler ordered Operation Sea Lion, a plan to invade England. But first, he needed control of the skies. The Battle of Britain begins. The Luftwaffe launched its campaign in July 1940. The goal: destroy the Royal Air Force, RAF, and force Britain to negotiate. At first, German bombers targeted shipping convoys and radar stations along the coast. The RAF, using a revolutionary radar network, detected incoming attacks and scrambled fighters to intercept. The young pilots of Fighter Command, many barely out of their teens, faced overwhelming odds. Britain could muster only about 600 frontline fighters, primarily Spitfires and Hurricanes, against nearly 2,000 German aircraft. The air battles over southern England were fierce, daily duels of speed, skill, and courage. The few. By August, the Luftwaffe shifted to bombing airfields and aircraft factories, hoping to cripple Britain's defenses. The RAF endured heavy losses, but German intelligence underestimated British production and resilience. Then, on August 24th, a German bomber accidentally dropped bombs on London. Churchill ordered a retaliatory strike on Berlin. Outraged, Hitler diverted his bombers from airfields to British cities. The Blitz had begun. The Blitz. From September 1940 to May 1941, German bombers rained destruction on London, Coventry, and other cities night after night. Entire neighborhoods burned. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed. Yet, far from breaking morale, the bombings steeled British resolve. People sheltered in underground stations, sang songs, and carried on daily life amidst the ruins. Churchill's speeches echoed through the radio waves. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The RAF held firm. By October 1940, the Luftwaffe had lost over 1,700 aircraft, while British losses were half that. The invasion was postponed indefinitely. Hitler's first major defeat had arrived. The war expands. Frustrated, Hitler turned his gaze toward the east, toward the vast plains of the Soviet Union. In Italy, Mussolini launched disastrous invasions of Greece and North Africa, dragging Germany into new theaters. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, President Franklin D. Roosevelt pushed the United States closer to aiding Britain through the Lend-Lease Act, declaring America the arsenal of democracy. The end of 1940, a shifting tide. By December 1940, Europe was under Nazi domination, yet Britain still stood defiant, the last bastion of resistance in the West. Hitler began planning his ultimate gamble. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. A campaign that would decide the fate of the world. In the ashes of Dunkirk and the glow of London's fires, humanity had entered a new phase of total war. The lines were drawn: democracy versus dictatorship, freedom versus tyranny. The year 1940 closed not with peace, but with a grim determination. The world knew the storm had only begun. Operation Barbarossa and the attack on Pearl Harbor. A world under Nazi shadow. By early 1941, Adolf Hitler's empire stretched from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean. France lay conquered, Norway and Denmark under occupation, and Central Europe bound to Berlin through alliance or fear. Yet one enemy still defied him: Britain. Despite the Blitz, the island fortress refused to surrender. The Luftwaffe had failed to gain air superiority, and Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, was indefinitely postponed. But Hitler's ambitions reached far beyond the English Channel. In his eyes, Britain persisted only because it hoped for help from the United States and the Soviet Union. Destroying one of these pillars, he believed, would bring the other down. He turned eastward to the vast lands of Russia. The Eastern Dream. Hitler's ideology, laid out in Mein Kampf, had long promised Lebensraum, living space, in the East. The Slavic peoples were to be enslaved, their lands colonized by Germans. Communism, he declared, was a Jewish conspiracy that had to be annihilated. His generals hesitated. They remembered Napoleon's disastrous march into Russia. But Hitler dismissed caution. "We have only to kick in the door," he boasted, "and the whole rotten structure will collapse." In December 1940, he issued Directive No. 21, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It would be the largest military operation in history, involving over 3 million Axis soldiers, 3,500 tanks, and 2,700 aircraft along a 1,800-mile front. Germany's growing Axis. While preparing for the Eastern Campaign, Germany tightened its grip on Europe. Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria joined the Axis, providing troops and oil. Mussolini's Italy stumbled through blunders in Greece and North Africa, forcing Hitler to send troops to rescue his ally. This intervention opened new fronts, the Balkans and the deserts of Libya and Egypt, that would stretch German resources thin. In April 1941, Hitler struck Yugoslavia and Greece, furious at Yugoslavia's defection from the Axis. Belgrade was bombed to ruins. Both countries surrendered within weeks. But the Balkan campaign delayed the start of Operation Barbarossa by nearly 2 months, a delay that would prove fatal when winter came. Operation Barbarossa begins June 22, 1941. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, the silence of a summer night shattered as German artillery opened fire along the Soviet frontier. Thousands of tanks and aircraft roared forward. 3 massive army groups advanced. Army Group North toward Leningrad, Center toward Moscow, and South toward Ukraine. The invasion caught Joseph Stalin completely off guard. Despite intelligence warnings, he had refused to believe Hitler would break the Nazi-Soviet pact. The first weeks were catastrophic for the USSR. The Luftwaffe destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft on the ground. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and annihilated in vast pockets. At Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev, millions of Red Army soldiers were killed or captured. The world watched in disbelief as the Wehrmacht swept across the steppes. German propaganda declared, "The Soviet Union has been smashed," but victory was an illusion. The Soviet fight for survival. The Soviet Union's strength lay not only in numbers but in endurance. Factories from Western Russia were dismantled and moved east beyond the Ural Mountains. New tanks and aircraft rolled off assembly lines even as the front burned. Stalin, who had momentarily vanished in shock, re-emerged on July 3rd, calling for a great patriotic war. The call to arms united Russians, Ukrainians, and countless others in a desperate defense of their homeland. As the summer wore on, German troops advanced hundreds of miles, but resistance stiffened. At Leningrad, citizens dug trenches and built barricades. By September, the city was encircled, beginning a siege that would last 872 days and claim over 1 million civilian lives. In the south, the Germans captured vast territories, but partisan warfare erupted behind their lines. Barbarossa turns to nightmare. By October, Army Group Center stood within sight of Moscow. Hitler launched Operation Typhoon, the final drive to capture the Soviet capital before winter. Yet the weather turned. Torrential rains turned roads into rivers of mud, bogging down tanks and trucks. Then came the cold, temperatures plunging below -30 degrees Celsius. German soldiers, still in summer uniforms, froze in their foxholes. Engines failed, rifles jammed, and frostbite ravaged entire divisions. Meanwhile, Soviet reinforcements arrived, fresh troops from Siberia, released after Stalin learned Japan would not attack from the east. Under the command of General Georgy Zhukov, these hardened veterans counterattacked in early December. The Red Army drove the Germans back from Moscow in the war's first major defeat for Hitler. The cost of the Eastern Front. By year's end, the Eastern Front had become a frozen hell. The Germans had advanced 600 miles but failed to capture Moscow or force Soviet collapse. Over 750,000 German soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing. Soviet losses exceeded 3 million, yet their will remained unbroken. The war Hitler thought would last weeks had become a struggle for survival. Barbarossa was not a campaign, it was a catastrophe in the making. The war in North Africa. While Europe froze, the deserts of North Africa erupted in heat and steel. Mussolini's ambitions to seize Egypt collapsed under British counterattacks. In February 1941, Hitler sent the Afrika Corps under General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, to restore the front. Rommel's lightning tactics soon drove the British back across Libya, turning the desert into a seesaw battlefield. Control of North Africa meant control of the Mediterranean and access to Middle Eastern oil. The struggle there would rage until 1943, tying down resources that might have been used in Russia. The Atlantic and the American role. Across the ocean, the United States stood on the edge of war. President Roosevelt was determined to aid Britain, calling the U.S. the arsenal of democracy. In March 1941, he signed the Lend-Lease Act, supplying billions in weapons, ships, and food to Britain and later the Soviet Union. German U-boats, meanwhile, stalked the Atlantic in wolf packs, sinking Allied convoys at terrifying rates. The Battle of the Atlantic became a deadly contest of technology and endurance. U.S. Navy destroyers began escorting British convoys even before formal entry into the war. bringing America dangerously close to combat. Japan's rising sun. While Europe burned, Japan sought dominance in Asia. Its brutal war in China drained resources, and Western embargoes, particularly the U.S. oil ban, threatened its survival. Japanese leaders, led by General Tojo and Emperor Hirohito, concluded that only by seizing the rich colonies of Southeast Asia could Japan sustain its empire. But to do so, they needed to neutralize the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. At dawn on Sunday, December 7, 1941, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers launched 353 planes toward Hawaii. At 7:55 a.m., the first wave struck. In 2 hours, battleships were burning, airfields shattered, and over 2,400 Americans killed. The USS Arizona exploded, entombing more than 1,100 sailors. It was a devastating surprise, but not a complete victory. The U.S. aircraft carriers, the real backbone of naval power, were out at sea and survived. The next day, President Roosevelt addressed Congress. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States declared war on Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on America. The world was now fully engulfed. A global conflict. By the end of 1941, World War II had become truly global, fought on every continent and ocean. The Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, stood at the height of their power, controlling vast territories. But they had awakened 2 giants, the United States and the Soviet Union. The stage was set for a conflict of unimaginable scale, a total war of men, machines, and ideologies. The following years would bring new horrors, from Stalingrad to Midway, from the Holocaust's terror to the dawn of the atomic age. Hitler had unleashed a war he could no longer control. The tide had not yet turned, but the momentum of destiny had shifted. 1942, the turning tides, Midway and El Alamein. By the opening months of 1942, the Axis powers appeared unstoppable. German forces held most of continental Europe, Rommel's Afrika Korps drove east toward Egypt, and Japan's sweeping victories across the Pacific had stunned the Allies. Yet beneath the surface of defeat, a subtle but decisive shift was beginning. The year 1942 would become the great pivot of the Second World War, the moment when Allied endurance, industrial strength, and strategic adaptation began to reverse Axis momentum. Japan ascendant. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japan advanced with breathtaking speed. Manila fell in January 1942. Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, surrendered in February, shocking Britain. By March, Rangoon and the Dutch East Indies were in Japanese hands, granting Tokyo control of vital oil and rubber supplies. The rising sun now stretched across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. But victory bred overconfidence. Japan's leaders misread America's resilience, assuming that a demoralized United States would negotiate. Instead, U.S. industry roared to life. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and California converted overnight from cars to bombers, tanks, and warships. In early 1942, thousands of new recruits flooded into training camps, and the aircraft carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown became the backbone of a reformed Pacific Fleet. The Doolittle Raid. President Roosevelt wanted an early blow to lift American morale. The daring plan came from Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, who proposed launching medium bombers from a carrier to strike Japan itself. On April 18, 1942, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers roared off the deck of the USS Hornet and bombed Tokyo and other cities. The damage was minor, but the psychological effect was immense. Americans exulted, and Japanese leaders were humiliated. Admiral Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, vowed to destroy the U.S. carriers that had dared approach his homeland. The Coral Sea. Yamamoto's first step was an assault on Port Moresby, New Guinea, a base that would threaten Australia if captured. In May 1942, Japanese and Allied fleets clashed in the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first naval battle fought entirely by aircraft. For 2 days, carrier planes dueled over open water. The Japanese lost the light carrier Shoho. The Americans lost the Lexington. Both sides claimed victory, but strategically the battle stopped Japan's southern advance. A crucial first check on expansion. Midway, the Pacific turns. Yamamoto next aimed for Midway Atoll, a tiny island 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Capturing it would lure the remaining American carriers into a trap. But U.S. Navy cryptanalysts at Pearl Harbor had broken key portions of Japan's naval code. Admiral Chester Nimitz thus knew when and where the Japanese would strike. On June 4, 1942, the decisive Battle of Midway began. Waves of Japanese bombers pounded Midway's defenses, unaware that 3 American carriers lay waiting. When the Japanese strike force rearmed planes for a second wave, U.S. dive bombers appeared suddenly from clear blue sky. In minutes, they hit and set ablaze Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and later Hiryu, 4 of Japan's 6 main carriers, destroyed with their veteran aircrews. Japan's offensive power in the Pacific was crippled. From that moment, the Allies would move gradually from defense to offense. The war in the desert. While naval airmen battled over the Pacific, the sands of North Africa became another decisive theater. The Western Desert Campaign had swung back and forth between British and Axis forces since 1940. In early 1942, German General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, launched a daring offensive from Libya. His Afrika Korps captured Tobruk in June, seizing 33,000 prisoners and threatening Egypt. Panic spread in Cairo. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill replaced his desert commanders, appointing General Bernard Montgomery to lead the Eighth Army. Montgomery was methodical, cautious, and utterly determined. He built up supplies, trained relentlessly, and fortified positions around the small railway halt of El Alamein, 60 miles from Alexandria, the last barrier before the Nile. The First Battle of El Alamein. In July 1942, Rommel attacked, hoping to break through before British reinforcements arrived. But the Eighth Army held firm. Intense artillery and air support stalled the Axis advance. Both sides suffered heavy losses, and by August a stalemate settled across the scorching desert. For Rommel, supply shortages, worsened by Allied naval control of the Mediterranean, became fatal. His fuel convoys from Italy were continually sunk by Malta-based aircraft and submarines. The Second Battle of El Alamein. By October, Montgomery was ready. His army now outnumbered Rommel's 2-to-1, supported by 1,000 tanks and 800 aircraft. On the night of October 23, 1942, under moonlight, British guns unleashed a devastating barrage, the start of the Second Battle of El Alamein. For 12 days, the desert echoed with explosions and the rumble of advancing armor. Slowly, the Axis lines buckled. On November 4th, Montgomery's tanks broke through. Rommel retreated westward toward Libya, leaving behind 30,000 prisoners. Churchill exulted. Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat. The victory marked the beginning of the Axis collapse in Africa. Operation Torch. Simultaneously, a new Allied offensive unfolded. On November 8, 1942, American and British troops landed in French Morocco and Algeria under Operation Torch, the first major U.S. ground operation of the war. Though initially resisted by Vichy French forces, most surrendered quickly. The landings trapped Rommel's army between the advancing British from the east and the new American forces from the west. For the first time, the Allies had coordinated a truly global offensive, an early glimpse of the partnership that would win the war. The Eastern Front, Stalingrad, begins. Meanwhile, in Europe's east, the struggle reached unimaginable scale. In summer 1942, Hitler launched Operation Blue, driving toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. The name alone carried symbolic weight. Stalin's city could not fall. The German Sixth Army under General Paulus reached its outskirts in August. Bombing turned Stalingrad into smoking ruins, yet the Soviets refused to yield. Fighting devolved into block-by-block combat. Snipers in rubble, flamethrowers in basements, soldiers clinging to every factory floor. Through autumn, Germans pushed slowly to the riverbank, but Soviet resistance stiffened. Then, in November, as icy winds swept across the steppe, Marshal Zhukov launched Operation Uranus. a massive counterattack that encircled the Sixth Army. More than 250,000 Axis troops were trapped inside the city. Hitler forbade retreat, not one step back. It was the beginning of the end for Germany in the East. The Holocaust expands. While battles raged, the Nazi regime escalated its genocidal policy. In 1942, at the Wannsee Conference, senior officials coordinated what they called the final solution, the systematic extermination of Europe's Jews. Extermination camps such as Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka began operating that spring. Auschwitz-Birkenau expanded with new gas chambers. Millions of men, women, and children were deported from ghettos in Poland, the Netherlands, France, and elsewhere. By year's end, entire communities had vanished. Though reports reached London and Washington, disbelief and the fog of war delayed any direct Allied response. Allied cooperation and production. Amid the suffering, Allied coordination strengthened. In Washington, British and American planners met in the combined chiefs of staff to unify strategy. Roosevelt and Churchill agreed that defeating Germany must remain the priority, even as Pacific battles continued. The United States' immense industrial capacity transformed warfare. In 1942 alone, America produced 47,000 planes, 24,000 tanks, and 8 million tons of shipping. Women filled factories, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter. Food rationing and war bonds bound civilians to the struggle. The tide turns. By December 1942, the long unstoppable Axis offensive had begun to unravel. In the Pacific, the Japanese faced relentless counterattacks on Guadalcanal. In Africa, Rommel was in retreat. In Russia, the Sixth Army faced annihilation. The global initiative was passing to the Allies. The world did not yet know it, but the worst bloodshed was still to come. 1943 would bring both horror and hope. The destruction of Stalingrad, the fall of Mussolini, and the slow beginning of liberation. 1943, the Axis falters. Stalingrad to Sicily. The winter of Stalingrad. 1943 began under a sky of smoke and blood over Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army, trapped by Operation Uranus, faced encirclement and starvation. Temperatures plummeted to -30°C, and supplies dwindled. Soldiers huddled in ruined factories, rationing what little food remained, while Soviet artillery and snipers claimed lives daily. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, pleaded with Hitler for permission to retreat, but Hitler refused. "There will be no retreat," he ordered. By February 2, 1943, the once feared Wehrmacht surrendered. Over 90,000 German soldiers were captured, and many would perish in Soviet camps. The Soviet Union had won its first decisive victory, a turning point in the East. Stalingrad shattered the myth of German invincibility and boosted Allied morale worldwide. Kursk, the last German offensive in the East. After Stalingrad, Hitler planned one final gamble. Operation Citadel, aimed at cutting a salient in the Kursk region. The Germans amassed 900,000 men, 2,700 tanks, and 2,000 aircraft, facing a Soviet force more than double their size. In July 1943, the battle began, becoming the largest tank battle in history. The Soviets, forewarned by intelligence, had heavily fortified the region with minefields, anti-tank guns, and dug-in infantry. Despite initial gains, German panzers were halted. Soviet counterattacks then encircled German units. By August, the offensive had failed. Kursk marked the permanent shift of initiative to the Allies on the Eastern Front. From that moment, the Red Army advanced relentlessly westward. Italy, Mussolini falls. In Italy, the war had gone poorly for Mussolini. Allied forces had landed in North Africa in 1942 and were pushing east, defeating Rommel. In July 1943, Allied forces launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. Italian defenses crumbled, and German forces were forced to withdraw. Faced with repeated military disasters and loss of public support, Mussolini was deposed on July 25, 1943. King Victor Emmanuel III had him arrested. Italy signed an armistice with the Allies in September, but German troops quickly occupied northern and central Italy, establishing a puppet state. the Italian campaign had begun. A grueling struggle of mountains, rivers, and entrenched defenders that would last until 1945. The Pacific, Guadalcanal, and the island-hopping campaign. Meanwhile, the Pacific War continued to intensify. In August 1942, Allied forces landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, marking the first major offensive against Japan. The campaign involved fierce jungle fighting, amphibious assaults, and relentless naval battles. The U.S. Marines endured extreme conditions, disease, hunger, and constant ambushes, but gradually secured the island. By February 1943, Japan evacuated its remaining forces. Guadalcanal marked the first major strategic victory for the Allies in the Pacific, shifting the initiative to American forces. The island-hopping strategy, bypassing heavily fortified Japanese strongholds and targeting critical positions, would dominate the remainder of the Pacific War. Strategic bombing and the battle for the skies. 1943 also saw the intensification of the strategic bombing campaign. American bombers launched daytime raids over Germany, while the RAF carried out nighttime raids. Cities like Hamburg, Berlin, and Cologne were heavily damaged. The Luftwaffe mounted fierce resistance, but Allied air power, aided by long-range fighter escorts like the P-51 Mustang, began to dominate. Industrial centers, transportation networks, and oil refineries were systematically targeted to weaken the Axis war machine. These raids were costly, thousands of aircrew died, but they disrupted production and forced Germany to divert critical resources to air defense. The Eastern Front advances. The Soviet Union pressed its advantage after Stalingrad. In 1943, massive offensives across the Don and Dnieper rivers liberated key territories in Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia. Cities such as Kharkov and Smolensk were retaken. The Red Army's ability to sustain long-term offensives demonstrated the industrial and human depth of the Soviet war effort. By late 1943, the Germans were in full retreat. Hitler's insistence on holding every inch of territory caused massive losses. Supply lines were stretched thin, morale crumbled, and the eventual collapse of Eastern Europe became inevitable. North Africa, the final push. After El Alamein and Torch, Allied forces began pushing Axis troops westward through Libya into Tunisia. By May 1943, the Africa Corps, under pressure from Montgomery's 8th Army and American forces under General Patton, surrendered in Tunisia. Over 250,000 Axis troops were captured, and North Africa was fully under Allied control. This victory opened the way for the Italian campaign, allowing Allied forces to invade Sicily and then mainland Italy, directly threatening German-occupied Europe from the south. The Holocaust expands. 1943 also saw the mechanization of genocide. In occupied Poland, the extermination camps of Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec were at peak operation. Mass deportations from Hungary, France, and the Netherlands began. The Nazis implemented industrialized killing with gas chambers, crematoria, and forced labor. By the end of 1943, over 2.5 million Jews had been murdered, and millions of Romani, disabled, and political prisoners were also victims of the regime. Reports of atrocities began reaching the Western Allies, fueling the moral imperative to defeat the Axis. Allied diplomacy and planning. 1943 marked increased coordination among the Allies. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met at the Tehran Conference to plan future offensives. They agreed on the principle of Germany first, focusing on defeating Hitler before turning full attention to Japan. Plans for Operation Overlord, the invasion of France, began taking shape. The United States ramped up production. Shipyards, aircraft factories, and munitions plants worked at unprecedented pace. Civilian populations endured rationing, air raid drills, and the constant anxiety of a total war economy. Every bullet, tank, and bomber was a lifeline in the fight against Axis domination. The year in perspective. By the end of 1943, the Axis had lost momentum. In the east, the Germans were retreating from Soviet advances. In North Africa and Italy, the Allies had gained strategic footholds. In the Pacific, Japan had been halted at Guadalcanal, and U.S. forces began moving forward. Allied industrial capacity and global coordination were increasing exponentially. Though the war would continue for 2 more brutal years, 1943 represented the beginning of Axis decline. The tide of history was turning. 1944, D-Day and the liberation of Western Europe. The stage for liberation. By 1944, the Allies had regained the strategic initiative. The Eastern Front saw Soviet forces advancing relentlessly toward Poland and Eastern Europe. In North Africa and Italy, Axis forces were in retreat, and the Italian peninsula was slowly being liberated by Allied troops. However, Hitler's Germany still posed an existential threat. The Atlantic Wall, a vast series of fortifications along the French coast, was meant to prevent any Allied landing. Beaches bristled with mines, bunkers, and artillery, while German troops fortified towns and hills. The Allies needed careful planning, deception, and immense coordination to breach these defenses. Operation Overlord, planning the D-Day invasion. The Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, commanded by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, prepared the largest amphibious assault in history, Operation Overlord. The plan was audacious. Land over 156,000 troops on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, supported by 5,000 ships and 13,000 aircraft. To ensure success, the Allies launched an elaborate deception campaign, Operation Bodyguard, designed to mislead the Germans into believing the main invasion would occur at Pas de Calais, across the English Channel from Normandy. Fake equipment, phantom armies, and radio transmissions successfully diverted German attention. D-Day, June 6, 1944, at 6:30 a.m. After a pre-dawn bombardment of German defenses, Allied forces stormed 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. At Utah, American forces faced light resistance and quickly secured the beach. At Omaha, Americans encountered fierce opposition, with cliffs, machine gun nests, and artillery causing devastating casualties. Despite this, small units and individual soldiers pressed forward, climbing bluffs under heavy fire. Gold, Juno, and Sword, primarily British and Canadian sectors, faced strong resistance but achieved their objectives, linking up with airborne troops dropped inland the night before. By nightfall, all 5 beaches had been secured, though at a cost of over 10,000 casualties, including 4,000 killed. The Allies had established a foothold on continental Europe, the beginning of the end for Nazi occupation. The battle for Normandy. Securing the beaches was only the first step. The ensuing Battle of Normandy lasted until late August 1944. German forces, reinforced by elite divisions, fought fiercely to contain the invasion. The Bocage countryside, with its thick hedgerows, slowed Allied armor, and made every village a potential battlefield. Allied forces gradually expanded their perimeter, capturing Cannes, a key city, after weeks of grueling combat. Simultaneously, airborne divisions disrupted German communications and supply lines, enabling a breakthrough toward Falaise. The Falaise Pocket and German collapse. By mid-August, Allied forces encircled German troops in the Falaise Pocket. Attempts to break out were costly, and tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured. The destruction of this pocket allowed the Allies to advance rapidly through northern France. Paris, liberated on August 25, 1944, celebrated a triumphant return of free French forces under Charles de Gaulle. Germany's hold on Western Europe was crumbling, and the Allies began their push toward Belgium, the Netherlands, and eventually Germany itself. The liberation of Western Europe. In the months following D-Day, the Allies liberated vast territories. Belgium, Antwerp became a crucial port for Allied supplies. The Netherlands, Dutch cities endured famine and brutal winter conditions, but liberation gradually reached them by late 1944. Luxembourg and northern France, freed by advancing troops. Allied air power dominated the skies, bombarding German industrial centers and transportation networks. Germany's resources were stretched thin, forced to defend multiple fronts simultaneously. The Pacific War advances. While Europe witnessed liberation, the Pacific theater continued its bloody island-hopping campaign. Key battles in 1944 included Saipan and Guam, securing bases for long-range B-29 bombers to strike Japan. Leyte Gulf, October 1944, the largest naval battle in history, where U.S. forces decimated the Japanese fleet, effectively ending Japan's ability to wage offensive naval operations. American forces moved steadily toward the Philippines and prepared for assaults on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, stepping stones toward the Japanese mainland. The Eastern Front, Soviet advances. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces advanced through Poland, liberating key cities and pushing the Germans toward their pre-war borders. Major operations in 1944 included Operation Bagration, June 1944, the destruction of Germany's Army Group Center in Belarus, resulting in over 400,000 German casualties. Liberation of Lithuania, Latvia, and parts of Ukraine, forcing the Germans into a general retreat toward Poland and East Prussia. The Soviets' sheer numerical strength, combined with relentless offensives and superior logistics, ensured Germany could not stabilize the Eastern Front. Strategic bombing intensifies. Allied bombers continued to hammer German cities and infrastructure. Dresden, Hamburg, and Berlin suffered heavy destruction. Oil refineries, rail lines, and factories were targeted to weaken Germany's war effort. These raids, though costly to civilians, contributed to Germany's inability to supply its forces across multiple fronts. Civilian resistance and partisan efforts. Across occupied Europe, resistance movements grew stronger. French Maquis sabotaged railways, communication lines, and German supply convoys. Polish Home Army launched uprisings, particularly in Warsaw, tying down German resources. Italian partisans attacked retreating German forces, assisting Allied advances. These groups, often operating with limited supplies, played crucial roles in disrupting German operations and preparing liberated territories for Allied governance. Preparing for the final push. By the end of 1944, Germany was retreating on all fronts. Yet Hitler refused to surrender or concede territory. He ordered V-1 and V-2 rocket attacks on London and other cities in a desperate attempt to slow Allied progress. Supplies were scarce, morale was low, and the German population began to realize the war could not be won. Allies prepared for the next major operations. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 would be Germany's last significant offensive in the West. The Eastern Front remained a brutal push toward Berlin. In the Pacific, the path toward Japan was steadily being carved, island by island. 1944 ended with the Axis powers in full retreat, a dramatic reversal from the heights of their early conquests. The fall of Berlin and the atomic end. The world at war in early 1945. By January 1945, World War II had entered its final, brutal phase. Nazi Germany was fighting for survival on all fronts. The Western Allies had crossed into Germany from France and Belgium, while Soviet forces were closing in from the east. Cities across the continent lay in ruins, infrastructure was collapsing, and millions of civilians faced starvation, displacement, or death. Hitler's command structure was crumbling. Communication lines were severed, officers were demoralized, and fanatical loyalty was the only thing keeping pockets of the Wehrmacht from surrendering. Yet Hitler still clung to dreams of miraculous victory, ordering last-ditch offensives even as the Allies' numerical and logistical superiority became overwhelming. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's final gamble. In December 1944, Germany launched its last major offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge. Adolf Hitler aimed to split the Allied forces in Belgium and Luxembourg, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. German forces initially achieved surprise, creating a bulge in the Allied front lines. American and British units were encircled in snow and freezing conditions. Civilians fled towns as tanks and artillery tore through the Ardennes. However, Allied air superiority, reinforcements, and resilient soldiers halted the German advance. By late January 1945, the offensive had failed. Over 100,000 German troops were killed, wounded, or captured, and the Allies regained momentum for the final push into Germany. The Battle of the Bulge marked Germany's last attempt at strategic initiative in the West. the Soviet advance to Berlin. While the West advanced, the Red Army launched massive offensives in the East. Operation Vistulioter, beginning in January 1945, pushed German forces back from Poland into eastern Germany. Soviet artillery, armor, and infantry moved in overwhelming waves. Cities such as Warsaw and Poznan were liberated, but at terrible cost. Millions of civilians died in the path of battle. By April 1945, the Soviets reached Berlin. The city, heavily fortified, became the final battleground of the European theater. Hitler had refused to evacuate, choosing instead to remain in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. The fall of Berlin. The Battle of Berlin began on April 16, 1945. Soviet forces encircled the city, bombarding it with artillery, tanks, and air strikes. German defenders, including young boys from the Volkssturm and remaining Wehrmacht units, fought desperately. Street by street, building by building, the city became a hellscape of fire, rubble, and death. As Soviet troops closed in on the Reich Chancellery, Hitler and his inner circle faced the inevitable. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide. The Third Reich's leadership collapsed in chaos. Germany surrenders. Following Hitler's death, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz assumed nominal control. He attempted to negotiate partial surrenders to the Western Allies, hoping to save German forces from Soviet captivity. However, unconditional surrender was demanded. On May 7, 1945, German forces signed the Instrument of Surrender in Reims, France, officially ending the war in Europe. Celebrations erupted across the Allied nations, though Europe itself remained scarred by destruction, mass displacement, and the horrifying revelations of the Holocaust. The Pacific Theater, the road to Japan. While Europe celebrated, the Pacific War continued fiercely. Japan, isolated but defiant, had fortified hundreds of islands across the Pacific. American forces continued their island-hopping campaign, capturing key positions such as Iwo Jima, February, March 1945, and Okinawa, April-June 1945. These battles were among the bloodiest of the war. Japanese soldiers often fought to the last man, employing kamikaze attacks and entrenched defenses. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, with tens of thousands killed in combat and air raids. The Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb. By mid-1945, the United States had developed the most terrifying weapon in history, the atomic bomb, a product of the top-secret Manhattan Project. Scientific brilliance, vast industrial resources, and intense secrecy had produced a weapon capable of leveling entire cities in minutes. President Roosevelt's death in April 1945 brought Harry S. Truman to the presidency. Truman faced the question of how to end the Pacific War without an invasion that could cost millions of Allied and Japanese lives. The atomic bomb offered a grim solution. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 6, 1945, the U.S. dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, instantly killing an estimated 70,000 people, with tens of thousands more dying from radiation in subsequent weeks. 3 days later, Nagasaki was bombed, killing an additional 40,000 to 75,000. The devastation shocked the world. Japan, facing annihilation and a complete collapse of its military, finally surrendered. Japan surrenders, VJ Day. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. Allied forces occupied Japan, and the formal signing occurred on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. World War II had officially ended, 6 years after it began, leaving tens of millions dead, entire nations destroyed, and the global order forever changed. The human cost and aftermath. World War II was unparalleled in its scale and horror. Over 70 million people died, including soldiers and civilians. The Holocaust claimed the lives of 6 million Jews, plus millions of other victims. Cities in Europe and Asia lay in ruins, with millions displaced. Economies were shattered, infrastructure destroyed, and political systems upended. The war also reshaped global power. The United States and Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, while Europe faced decades of reconstruction. The United Nations was founded to prevent future conflicts, though the seeds of the Cold War had already been sown. Lessons of 1939 to 1945. World War II taught humanity the extremes of both human cruelty and resilience. It demonstrated the dangers of unchecked aggression and ideology, the transformative power of technology in warfare, the importance of international alliances and coordinated strategy, the enduring capacity of individuals and nations to resist oppression, even under unimaginable circumstances. From the Blitzkriegs of 1939 to the atomic bombings of 1945, the conflict reshaped the modern world in ways still felt today. Reflections, global impact, and untold stories. The immediate aftermath. By the end of 1945, the world was exhausted. Cities lay in rubble, economies were shattered, and tens of millions of survivors faced displacement, famine, and trauma. The sheer scale of destruction was unprecedented. Hiroshima and Nagasaki in ruins, Berlin in ashes, Warsaw decimated, and countless villages and towns across Europe and Asia obliterated. Millions of refugees wandered across Europe, Asia, and the Pacific Islands. Families were torn apart. Survivors of concentration camps faced the grim task of rebuilding their lives while carrying the memories of unimaginable horrors. The Holocaust and war crimes. The Holocaust's full extent became widely known only after Allied forces liberated the camps. Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Treblinka, each revealed industrialized mass murder. These atrocities shocked the world and prompted the establishment of the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi leaders were prosecuted for crimes against humanity. The trials set a legal precedent. Political and military leaders could be held accountable for systematic atrocities. Leaders such as Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and others were convicted, some executed, and others imprisoned. Political reordering of the world. World War II radically altered the global balance of power. United States and Soviet Union emerged as superpowers. Western Europe was politically weakened, leading to the Marshall Plan for Reconstruction. Japan was occupied and reformed under U.S. guidance, adopting democracy and demilitarization. Germany was divided into occupation zones, eventually becoming East and West Germany, setting the stage for the Cold War. Colonial empires also began to unravel. India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and many African nations accelerated movements for independence, influenced by the war's demonstration of both European vulnerability and the ideals of freedom and self-determination. Economic and technological transformations. World War II transformed economies and technology in ways that shaped the modern era. Industrial scale and efficiency. The war forced nations to mobilize entire economies for production. Factories produced planes, tanks, and ships at rates never seen before. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, permanently altering gender roles. Technological breakthroughs. Radar, jet engines, rockets, computers, and nuclear weapons all emerged from wartime research. The Manhattan Project marked the start of the nuclear age. Transportation and communication innovations. Rail, shipping, aviation, and radio communication advanced rapidly due to strategic necessity. Untold stories of valor and resistance. Beyond the major battles, countless untold stories reveal human courage. Partisan movements in France, Poland, Yugoslavia, and Italy disrupted Axis operations. They sabotaged railways, freed prisoners, and provided intelligence to the Allies. Women in war played critical roles. In factories, nursing, intelligence, and resistance networks. The women of Bletchley Park, for example, helped crack the German Enigma code, directly contributing to Allied victories. Forgotten theaters. The war's impact stretched to Latin America, Africa, and the Arctic. Soldiers fought under harsh climates and remote conditions, often overlooked in mainstream histories. Cultural and social impact. World War II reshaped societies globally. Art and literature reflected trauma, heroism, and loss, from the works of survivors to post-war cinema exploring human resilience. Migration and displacement. Millions became refugees, altering demographics in Europe and Asia. Cities like Berlin, Warsaw, and Tokyo required massive rebuilding. Collective memory, memorials, museums, and annual remembrances became integral to national identity, preserving lessons for future generations. Lessons learned. The war offered enduring lessons. The dangers of authoritarianism and unchecked ideology. Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy illustrated the catastrophic consequences of totalitarian rule. Importance of international alliances. The Grand Alliance of the United States, Soviet Union, and United Kingdom demonstrated how cooperation was essential for defeating a global threat. Technological responsibility. The atomic bomb highlighted the ethical implications of scientific advancement. Human resilience. Despite unimaginable suffering, individuals and communities adapted, resisted, and rebuilt. The Cold War seeds. While World War II ended in 1945, it set the stage for decades of tension. Germany and Berlin's division created ideological front lines. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet influence, creating satellite states. The United States' nuclear monopoly initially shaped global diplomacy. Conflicting visions of post-war order between East and West led to political, economic, and military rivalries lasting until 1991. Reflections on humanity. World War II revealed both humanity's capacity for evil and extraordinary courage. Entire cities were leveled, yet communities rebuilt. Genocide and mass murder were perpetrated, yet countless acts of heroism, kindness, and resistance emerged. This duality remains a central lesson of the war. Vigilance against tyranny, commitment to justice, and the moral imperative to remember and learn from history. The legacy of 1939 to 1945. The war's legacy is visible in nearly every aspect of modern life. Political structures shaped by post-war treaties and organizations like the United Nations. Global alliances such as NATO and the European Union emerged from lessons learned. Technological and scientific advancement accelerated by wartime necessity. Cultural memory and education ensured that the horrors, heroism, and lessons of the conflict would not be forgotten. From the Blitzkriegs that shocked the world to the atomic bombings that ended the Pacific War, 1939 to 1945 changed the world permanently, redefining nations, societies, and the human spirit. Complete timeline, key figures, and detailed maps. The chronology of global conflict. 1939. September 1st, Germany invades Poland, starting World War II. September 3rd, Britain and France declare war on Germany. September 17th, Soviet Union invades eastern Poland. November-December, Soviet Union invades Finland. Winter War. 1940. April-May, Germany invades Denmark, Norway, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France. June 22nd, France surrenders. Vichy regime established. July-October, Battle of Britain. Luftwaffe fails to achieve air superiority. September, Tripartite Pact forms Axis powers. Germany, Italy, Japan. 1941. June 22nd, Germany invades the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. December 7th, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. U.S. enters the war. December 8th to 11th, U.S. and Britain declare war on Japan. Germany declares war on the U.S. 1942. January-March, Japanese expansion across Southeast Asia and Pacific. May, Battle of the Coral Sea. First naval battle fought by aircraft. June 4th to 7th, Battle of Midway. U.S. decisively defeats Japanese carriers. October-November, Second Battle of El Alamein. Montgomery defeats Rommel. 1943. January-February, Soviets encircle German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. July-August, Allies invade Sicily. Mussolini deposed. September, Italy surrenders. German forces occupy northern Italy. July-August, Battle of Kursk. Largest tank battle. Soviets gain initiative. 1944. June 6th, D-Day. Allied invasion of Normandy. June-August, Battle of Normandy. Allies secured victory by 1943, opening Italy for invasion. Technology and weaponry. Tanks, Panzer IV, Tiger I, Sherman, T-34. Decisive in armored warfare. Aircraft, Spitfire, Messerschmitt Bf-109, B-17-0. Air superiority shifted outcomes. Naval aircraft carriers became the primary naval weapon. U-boats dominated Atlantic early, countered later by convoys and sonar. Weapons of mass destruction, atomic bombs, V-1 and V-2 rockets. Code-breaking, Enigma, Purple Code. Intelligence proved critical at Midway, Alamein, and Normandy. Lesser-known theaters. Arctic convoys, supplying USSR via the northern route, braving harsh conditions and German attacks. Burma Campaign, Allied forces, including Indian and Chinese troops, fought Japanese forces in jungles and mountains. Italy Campaign, prolonged mountain warfare. Liberation of Rome in June 1944. French resistance, critical in sabotaging German operations before and after D-Day. Casualties and human cost. Military deaths, 25-30 million. Civilian deaths, 45-50 million. Holocaust victims, 6 million Jews, 5 million others. Total, 70-80 million lives lost. Entire populations traumatized. Conclusion: World War II reshaped humanity's understanding of war, morality, and global governance. Its lessons reverberate today. The necessity of international cooperation, vigilance against tyranny, and the cost of unchecked aggression. From the Blitzkriegs of 1939 to the atomic bombings of 1945, the war created a new world order. One shaped by superpowers, global institutions, and the enduring memory of human courage and suffering. Analysis of strategy, politics, and the legacy of World War II. Strategic lessons from World War II. World War II demonstrated the evolution of warfare from trench and static combat to a fully mechanized and global conflict. Key strategic lessons included combined arms and mechanization. Coordinating tanks, artillery, infantry, and air power proved decisive. Germany's early Blitzkrieg tactics in Poland and France showcased the speed and shock value of mechanized warfare. Air superiority is critical. Control of the skies determined outcomes in battles from Britain to the Pacific. Aircraft carriers became more valuable than battleships. Intelligence and deception. Code-breaking, Enigma, Purple Code, and deception operations, Bodyguard, Fortitude, shaped the outcome of campaigns like Normandy and Midway. Logistics and industrial capacity. The war highlighted the importance of supply lines, production capabilities, and civilian labor mobilization. The Allies' ability to outproduce Axis powers directly influenced victory. Adaptability. Nations that adapted strategies to changing circumstances, e.g., the Soviets after early German successes, the US in the Pacific gained lasting advantages. Political dimensions. The war was as much political as it was military. Leaders navigated alliances, ideologies, and global pressure. Allied cooperation. Despite ideological differences, the US, UK, and USSR coordinated strategy, prioritizing the defeat of Germany first. Axis coordination failures. Germany, Italy, and Japan often acted independently, failing to support one another effectively. Strategic missteps, like Hitler's refusal to retreat from Stalingrad, contributed to disaster. Neutral nations. Countries like Sweden, Switzerland, and Spain maintained neutrality but often engaged in trade, espionage, or humanitarian support, impacting the war's economy and intelligence. Occupation policies. Nazi occupation policies in Europe fueled resistance, undermined local collaboration, and drew Allied attention to atrocities, influencing military and political decisions. Economic and industrial warfare. World War II was fought not just on battlefields but in factories and ports. Allied industrial output. The U.S. produced 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, and 2.4 million trucks during the war, outmatching Axis production. War economies. Rationing, conscription, and state-controlled production allowed nations to sustain prolonged campaigns. Technology and innovation. Jet engines, radar, proximity fuses, penicillin, and atomic weapons reshaped both military and civilian life. The human experience. While military strategy dominated narratives, the human dimension of World War II cannot be understated. Civilian suffering, bombings, forced labor, genocide, and displacement caused millions of deaths and long-term trauma. Cities like Hiroshima, Dresden, Warsaw, and Tokyo were leveled, leaving survivors to rebuild. Heroism and resistance. From partisans in Eastern Europe to intelligence officers in Britain and the United States, countless individuals risked their lives to save others or turn the tide of battle. Women and minorities. World War II transformed social structures. Women entered industrial and military roles. Minorities fought in segregated units, gaining experience and asserting civil rights claims post-war. Global geopolitical shifts. World War II reshaped the world order dramatically. Emergence of superpowers. The US and USSR dominated post-war politics, leading to the Cold War. Decolonization. European colonial powers weakened, accelerating independence movements in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Formation of the United Nations. Designed to prevent another global conflict, the UN reflected lessons learned from the failures of the League of Nations. Germany and Japan occupied and rebuilt. The Allies restructured defeated nations politically and economically, introducing democratic governance and curbing militarism. Ethical and moral reflections. The atrocities of World War II forced humanity to confront its darkest potentials. The Holocaust, industrialized genocide, highlighted the consequences of racial hatred, propaganda, and authoritarian control. Strategic bombing. Allied air campaigns raised questions about civilian casualties and proportionality in warfare. Atomic weapons. Hiroshima and Nagasaki initiated debates on nuclear ethics that persist today. Justice and accountability. The Nuremberg trials and Tokyo trials codified crimes against humanity and individual accountability for war crimes. Lessons for future conflicts. World War II left enduring military, political, and ethical lessons. Alliances and diplomacy are critical to collective security. Industrial and technological readiness determines long-term strategic advantage. Total war impacts civilians and societies. Their protection remains a moral imperative. Intelligence and strategy can turn tides faster than sheer numbers alone. Post-war reconstruction is essential for lasting peace. Cultural legacy. World War II shaped global culture, memory, and identity. Literature and film. Works like The Diary of Anne Frank, Schindler's List, and countless memoirs preserve individual experiences. Memorials and museums. Sites like Auschwitz, Normandy, Hiroshima, and Yad Vashem educate generations about the war's human cost. National identity, victory, and suffering reshaped countries' sense of self, from the US and USSR to France and Japan. The war in historical perspective. World War II was more than a military conflict. It was a crucible of humanity. It accelerated technology, reshaped borders, destroyed empires, and redefined ethics. Nations, leaders, and individuals faced choices under extreme conditions, from moral courage to catastrophic failure. Its lessons continue to resonate. Vigilance against tyranny, the cost of prejudice, and the importance of global cooperation. From the Blitzkriegs of 1939 to the atomic bombings of 1945, humanity was tested and transformed forever. Concluding thoughts. The story of 1939 to 1945 is one of extremes. Destruction and creation, cities and societies destroyed, but new political and social orders emerged. Cruelty and heroism, genocide and atrocities, but also resistance, sacrifice, and courage. Technology and human agency, atomic weapons, tanks, and aircraft reshaped conflict, yet human choices determine morality and outcome. The war's end did not erase its lessons. It created the modern world, laying foundations for international cooperation, human rights, and global governance. To study World War II is to understand the limits and potentials of humanity, a reminder that the past is never truly past, but a guide for the future. Every story from history teaches us something powerful. If you enjoyed uncovering this untold chapter of World War II, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to History Unfolded. Join our mission to bring forgotten battles back to life. And if you are watching till now, then you are a true legend who wants to know about World War and see you in the next story from the past. Till now, you can check our more videos on our channel.